On the policy level, we're also trying to think of ways to make sure that community colleges do things like sign the type of agreement that we've see happen here, for example, but at lots of schools, to make sure that students have a pathway to a 4-year program. By starting in community college and then moving on to a 4-year school, they can pursue higher education at a much more affordable cost. And cost is really the next thing I want to talk to you about. And that's specifically to talk about a really, really big number that gets tossed around about student debt and how it particularly impacts women. So another thing that we know that's being talked about on college campuses, talked about by students, is that total student loans outstanding in the economy rose to over $1 trillion in the first quarter of 2014. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is actually the one that measures this most frequently, and so it's their research that gives us this sort of benchmark, if you will. That's a lot of debt outstanding in the economy. We're finding it's more than any other type of consumer debt, from credit cards to various other different tools that people use. And while we understand how incredibly valuable student debt is because it's an investment in higher education, it's an investment in students' future, their future careers, and their future earnings, we also have a lot of concerns about how this level of debt can really impact individuals' ability to have economic security moving on through their lives. And I think you all know this, but how do you buy a house or how do you buy a car after taking on a pretty big student loan to make it through? And in particular, we worry because there are a lot of students who take on this debt and then aren't able to complete their degree. And that really feels like a little bit of a black hole. It's tough for students and borrowers to get out from that. If they weren't able to attain the credential or the certificate that would help them, then earn more to help repay the debt. But why we should care about, why AUW particularly cares about it, is because we also know that women in particular, graduates, have more trouble paying back their student debt than their male peers. And I passed around a sort of a short blog entry that I think gives you some of the main takeaways from that. So I want to make sure you know that you have that to come back to. But AUW's research in 2012, Graduating to a Pay Gap, really outlined exactly how student debt crisis is a women's issue. What we found is that following graduation, women borrowers are more likely to have a debt burden, a student debt burden, that is more than they can afford to pay back. They're far more likely than their male peers. And that's what this chart is telling us, is that over half of women graduates have a student loan debt burden that's more than they can afford, whereas only about 39% of male borrowers do. That's huge. That's more than half of women graduates, recent women graduates, who are struggling every month to make their student debt repayments. They're struggling to balance things like rent and their health insurance, their groceries, the long list of things that we know that people are strapped with every month. And they're adding student debt to it that they don't know how to repay. And that's why AUW comes to the table on this. While we all may agree that $1 trillion outstanding in the economy is a lot of money, we also know that women in particular are struggling with this. The question is, of course, why? And AUW's research pointed out that one of the big problems is something we've all been working on for a long, long time, the gender wage gap. Specifically, we found that the gender wage gap starts 1 year after college, even when controlling for everything you can imagine. Type of job, hours worked, major, all the laundry list of things that, yes, would make people slightly different in their compensation. Comparing apples to apples, there's a pay gap from day one. And that pay gap is impacting students, women's ability to repay their student debt. It's really troubling, and so we've been trying to figure out ways to make a difference here. And one of them is that you may be familiar with the fact that we've asked you to weigh in recently about helping get programs like income-based repayment and public service loan forgiveness off the ground and get it into the hands of more students. These are really great programs. They help people who have taken on debt pay according to the income that they have. It can extend the term so that they aren't saddled with the type of monthly payment that they can't afford. In addition, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is one that helps students who've decided to pursue a career in public service, working for a nonprofit, working for their local community, working for their local government. It helps them find a sort of light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to paying back their debt, and recognizes that we need more people to step up and hold those careers. And by the way, they do tend to be women overwhelmingly. And so these programs can be incredibly helpful for students. A lot of them don't know about it. Does anyone know someone who's repaying a loan and maybe you've talked to them about how they can manage it? I do, yeah. Have you mentioned income-based repayment? Anyone? It's a great program out there. And so I think that when we talk about how student debt impacts women, AUW can really play a role here by helping to share information about existing programs, things that we fought for. These are public policies that we've managed to get passed through Congress. We can be sharing more information about these tools, and we can also be pushing to make sure that more people are included and more people are a part of them. In addition to things like how you repay your debt, we also want to make sure that we're having a conversation about the investment in higher education that's happening on the federal and state level to kind of bring costs down. And your state can play a huge role here, and we encourage our AAUW state organizations and branches to advocate for an additional investment in higher education to make it possible for students to not have to borrow this much money and take on this level of debt when they pursue higher education. Finally, we're also always advocating to make sure that things like Pell Grants, which I know many of you may know what a valuable tool they are, remain available to students at a level that's really impactful for them when it comes to paying for their education. The actual value of the Pell Grant has gone down substantially over the past 20 years. It's a drop in the bucket for some students right now, and we want to continue to see that that opportunity remains for students to pay for education.